The rain had not yet started, but the sky over Portland that afternoon carried the weight of something unsettled. Clouds stretched low and gray, pressing down on the small airport as if nature itself were holding its breath. November 24th, 1971. Just another quiet Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Travelers shuffled through the terminal, their minds on family, on dinner tables waiting hundreds of miles away. No one noticed him at first. Why would they? He looked ordinary, too ordinary. A middle-aged man, neatly dressed in a dark suit and tie, a raincoat folded over his arm, a briefcase in his hand. He blended into the blur of passengers, moving with the calm assurance of someone who had done this 100 times before. When he approached the counter, he didn't hesitate. He slid a stack of cash across to the ticket agent and asked for a one-way ticket on Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 to Seattle. The clerk printed it without a second thought. His name, as written on the ticket, was simple, forgettable: Dan Cooper. He did not know it then, but history would remember him differently. He walked toward the gate, slipping through the crowd with the same quiet composure. Nothing about him screamed danger. Nothing hinted at chaos. He was just another man traveling on the eve of a holiday. But as he stepped aboard the Boeing 727, carrying 36 passengers and 6 crew members, he was already a ghost in the making. Inside, he took his seat near the back, placing his briefcase carefully on the floor beside him. The flight attendants, busy with boarding procedures, barely registered him. To them, he was polite, well-mannered, even unremarkable. He ordered a bourbon and soda, lit a cigarette, and settled in, as though the world beyond that small plane no longer existed. Yet beneath that calm exterior, he was already setting in motion one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. Because Dan Cooper, soon to be misremembered as D.B. Cooper, was not just a passenger. He was about to vanish into legend. The engines hummed as Flight 305 lifted off the runway, carving a path into the thick November clouds. Passengers settled into their seats, jackets draped over armrests, magazines opening, conversations beginning to fade beneath the steady drone of the aircraft. It was a short flight, barely 30 minutes to Seattle. Nobody expected anything unusual. At the back of the plane, the man called Dan Cooper sat motionless, his bourbon glass half empty, the faint curl of cigarette smoke drifting above him. He adjusted his tie with measured precision, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the dim cabin light. He looked, to anyone watching, like a businessman lost in thought. But then, with a gesture as calm as it was deliberate, he reached into his briefcase. From inside, he pulled out a folded note. He waited, patient, controlled, until the young flight attendant, Florence Schaffner, walked past. Without a word, he slipped the note into her hand. Florence barely glanced at it at first. Men passed her notes all the time, usually phone numbers, invitations written with nervous handwriting. She tucked it quickly into her pocket and moved to step away. That was when Cooper leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Miss," he said, almost politely, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Florence froze. Her hand, now trembling, unfolded the paper. The words were written in careful block letters, each one sharp and without hesitation. It was not flirtation. It was a declaration. Cooper's eyes remained on her as he cracked open the briefcase just enough to show her. Inside, wires, cylinders, the suggestion of destruction. He closed it again with quiet finality. "Sit down," he told her. "I'll tell you what I want." And so, while the passengers around them continued chatting, sipping coffee, flipping through newspapers, Florence took a seat beside the man who had just turned their short evening flight into something history would never forget. Cooper spoke evenly, as though reading from a script he had rehearsed many times. He demanded $200,000 in cash. He demanded 4 parachutes. And he demanded a fuel truck to be waiting when they landed in Seattle, ready to refill the plane for another journey. It was not the request of a desperate man. It was the plan of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Florence, pale but composed, nodded. She stood slowly and walked toward the cockpit, her footsteps sounding louder to her than the roar of the engines. She handed the note to Captain William Scott. The flight crew read the words in silence, a chill settling over them. In the air above the Pacific Northwest, with only minutes before landing, they were suddenly prisoners of a man who had spoken calmly, shown no fear and left no room for refusal. And in that moment, the passengers still had no idea. They were sipping their drinks, smiling at their seatmates, unaware that their lives now hinged on the quiet man in seat 18C, who had just rewritten the rules of American aviation forever. Word traveled fast through the cockpit. The captain and his crew exchanged a series of tense, quiet glances. In the world of aviation, hijackings were not unheard of. But this was different. The man behind them had not raised his voice, had not acted erratic. He was calm, almost businesslike, and that made him even more dangerous. The crew radioed ahead to air traffic control. Within minutes, the FBI and local law enforcement were already moving. Instructions were relayed. Cooperate, stall for time, and get the passengers on the ground alive. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the flight attendants followed Cooper's every instruction. He was precise, polite, and strangely courteous. He allowed them to sit beside him, to ask questions, to relay his terms. At one point, he even paid his drink tab, handing Florence a $20 bill and suggesting she keep the change. Outside, the window, night was falling. Rain streaked across the glass as the Boeing 727 began its slow descent toward Seattle. On the ground, FBI agents scrambled to gather $200,000 in cash. Random bills, unmarked, carefully photographed so each could be traced. 4 parachutes were hastily collected from a nearby skydiving school, along with a reserve chute. Cooper had been specific. He wanted 2 main parachutes and 2 reserve chutes. That detail unsettled investigators. Why 4? Did he plan to take a hostage with him? At 5:45 p.m., Flight 305 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. The passengers, still unaware of the storm brewing around them, waited patiently as the aircraft taxied to a remote section of the runway. From the windows, they could see emergency vehicles stationed in the distance, lights glowing faintly through the drizzle. Then, one by one, Cooper's demands were met. A ground crew rolled the fuel truck toward the plane. A Northwest Orient representative carried a large canvas bag. Inside, the $200,000 in bundled cash. And finally, 4 parachutes were handed over. Cooper inspected each delivery with meticulous attention. He counted the bundles, checked the straps of the parachutes, and gave curt nods of approval. His calm never wavered. Only then did he allow the 36 passengers to leave. They shuffled down the stairway, confused but unharmed, stepping out into the wet night air. Many had no idea they had just been part of a hijacking until law enforcement whisked them away for questioning. Inside the plane, though, the real game was only beginning. Cooper kept the crew of 6 on board: the pilot, the co-pilot, the flight engineer, and 3 flight attendants. He instructed the cockpit to plot a new course, south, toward Mexico City. But with one condition: the plane must fly low, under 10,000 feet. The landing gear must remain down, the cabin lights dimmed, and the rear staircase, the only Boeing 727 with such a feature, must be unlocked, ready to deploy mid-air. It was a request so bizarre, so specific, that even the FBI began to realize this was not the work of an amateur. Whoever D.B. Cooper was, he knew exactly what he wanted, and he was about to disappear into the night to claim it. The passengers were gone. The cabin now sat in uneasy silence, its only occupants the crew, and the man who held their lives in the palm of his hand. Outside, the rain thickened, streaking across the Boeing 727's fuselage as ground crews completed the final fueling. Cooper adjusted his tie, sat back in his seat, and lit another cigarette. He looked almost relaxed, as though this were all routine. For the flight attendants who remained, it was surreal. This was not the face of a desperate man, but someone in absolute control of himself and of them. At 7:40 p.m., under Cooper's orders, Flight 305 took off again. Its nose pointed south into the storm, its landing gear down, flaps partially extended, an unusual configuration that forced the plane to fly slowly, low to the ground. In the cockpit, Captain Scott and his crew followed Cooper's instructions to the letter. They had no choice. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Cooper grew quieter, more focused. He checked the parachutes, examining their straps and cords with the calm precision of a man familiar with such equipment. He secured the bag of money tightly to himself, fashioning it with parachute cord so it would not separate during the jump. Every move suggested experience. This was not improvisation. This was preparation. As the plane pushed through the turbulent skies, Cooper issued his final demand. The crew were to remain in the cockpit with the door shut. No one was to follow him. No one was to watch. At 8 p.m., a warning light flickered in the cockpit, an indication that the rear staircase had been lowered mid-flight. The crew felt a shift in pressure, the faint rush of air flooding the fuselage. Somewhere behind them, in the storm-lashed darkness, Cooper was making his move. The minutes stretched long, each one heavy with uncertainty. Then, at 8:13 p.m., the plane jolted suddenly, an abrupt upward movement, as though the weight of something had just left it. The cockpit crew exchanged looks. They did not need to ask what had happened. D.B. Cooper had jumped. Somewhere over the dense forests of southwestern Washington, with rain battering the earth and winds howling through the trees, a man in a business suit leapt from the rear of a Boeing 727, strapped with $200,000 in cash, and vanished into the night. When the plane finally landed in Reno hours later, Cooper was gone. The parachutes were gone. The money was gone. All that remained was an empty seat, a lingering trail of cigarette smoke, and the greatest unsolved mystery in American aviation. The moment Flight 305 touched down in Reno without its hijacker, the hunt began. Federal agents swarmed the aircraft, examining every seat, every tray table, every scrap of paper Cooper may have left behind. But what they found only deepened the enigma. On his seat, they recovered a black clip-on tie with a mother-of-pearl tie pin still attached. They found 8 filter-tipped cigarette butts in the ashtray, and they found the handwritten notes he had given the flight attendants, though Cooper had been careful to take back the original ransom letter, leaving only fragments of his instructions. But there was no sign of the man himself, no parachute, no cash, nothing but absence. The FBI launched NORJAC, short for Northwest Hijacking, a massive investigation that would stretch on for decades. Hundreds of agents were mobilized. Military aircraft were ordered to retrace the flight path. Helicopters and search teams combed the dense forests of southwest Washington, where Cooper was believed to have landed. Yet nature itself seemed to conspire against them. The terrain was unforgiving: vast wilderness, steep ridges, and thick evergreen forests, stretching endlessly in every direction. That night had been stormy, the winds fierce, visibility near zero. Even skilled paratroopers would have struggled, and still, no trace. In the weeks that followed, the FBI questioned dozens of suspects, ranging from ex-military men to missing persons who bore even the faintest resemblance to Cooper. Airports tightened security nationwide. New rules were drafted to prevent hijackers from exploiting the same weaknesses. Metal detectors, X-ray screening, and stricter boarding procedures would soon become standard across the United States, all because of one man who walked onto a plane with a briefcase and vanished. But the real question haunted investigators. Had Cooper even survived the jump? Some experts insisted it was suicide. The conditions were brutal: pitch-black skies, freezing rain, powerful winds, and rough wilderness below. The parachute Cooper used was a non-steerable training chute, hardly suitable for precision landing. Weighted down by 40 pounds of cash strapped to his body, he should have broken bones on impact, if not been killed outright. And yet, no body was ever found. No parachute, no clothing, nothing. As weeks turned into months, then years, Cooper did not reappear. No ransom money surfaced in circulation. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed him whole. The manhunt continued, but in the silence of the forests of Washington, the legend of D.B. Cooper was already taking shape. The FBI worked tirelessly, but as days turned to months, one truth became harder to ignore. There was no sign of D.B. Cooper, no evidence he had died, and no evidence he had lived. Only absence. And so, the theories began. The first, and perhaps most logical, was that Cooper had not survived the jump. Investigators argued that he had leapt into conditions no professional skydiver would have chosen: stormy winds, below freezing temperatures, and near total darkness. He wore a business suit and loafers, hardly gear for a survivalist. Worse still, he had chosen the older of the parachutes provided to him, one that lacked steering controls. With 40 pounds of cash tied to him, it was easy to believe he had been pulled off course, slammed into trees, or drowned in one of the icy rivers that cut through the wilderness. And yet, there was no body, no torn parachute tangled in the evergreens, no clothing shredded by impact. Nothing. For all the FBI's searching, the forest yielded silence. Others argued the opposite, that Cooper had not only survived, but had planned it all to perfection. His choice of the Boeing 727, one of the few commercial planes with a rear staircase that could be lowered mid-flight, was too precise to be coincidence. His knowledge of aviation, of parachutes, of fuel ranges, it all suggested training, maybe military. If so, then he knew exactly what he was doing. But if he lived, where did he go? Why had not a single bill of the marked ransom money surfaced in circulation? The case might have slipped toward obscurity, if not for a discovery nearly a decade later. In 1980, a young boy digging in the sand along the Columbia River, some 20 miles from Cooper's presumed drop zone, unearthed something astonishing. 3 bundles of cash, still bound with rubber bands, totaling $5,800. The serial numbers matched the Cooper ransom money. Suddenly, the case was alive again. Investigators swarmed the site, scouring the area for more. But there was nothing. No parachute, no bones, no sign of the hijacker. Only those few decaying stacks of bills buried by time and tide. The find raised more questions than it answered. Had Cooper drowned in the river, his money washing downstream? Or had he buried it intentionally, leaving a breadcrumb trail for reasons no one could explain? Each theory twisted into another. Some believed he landed safely and escaped with most of the cash, discarding only a small portion that later surfaced on the riverbank. Others suspected the entire stash was lost in the wilderness, rotting quietly beneath moss and soil. The only certainty was this: in all the years that followed, not a single other bill from the ransom money ever entered circulation. And so, the mystery deepened. Cooper had become more than a fugitive. He had become a ghost that even the most relentless investigation could not pin down. As years passed, the investigation shifted from searching the forests to chasing shadows of men who might have been D.B. Cooper. Each suspect carried a fragment of possibility: military experience, a criminal past, a resemblance to sketches, but none could be proven. One of the earliest names was Richard Floyd McCoy, a former Army veteran and skydiver who, in 1972, pulled off an eerily similar hijacking. Using a near-identical method, he hijacked a Boeing 727, demanded $500,000, and parachuted out into the night. But unlike Cooper, McCoy was caught. His face, his money, his fingerprints all betrayed him. Some believed McCoy was simply a copycat, inspired by the mystery of Cooper. Others whispered he was Cooper himself, striking again with refinements. Yet the FBI dismissed the link. McCoy's features, they argued, did not align, and he had an airtight alibi for Thanksgiving Eve, 1971. Then came Dwayne Webber. On his deathbed in 1995, he told his wife, "I am Dan Cooper." Shocked, she recalled how he had once woken from nightmares, mumbling about leaving fingerprints on an airplane. He had scars on his legs, she said, consistent with a parachute landing. He had even once taken her to the Columbia River, pointing to a spot and saying, "That's where Cooper buried the money." Yet when tested, no DNA match could be found linking him to the tie Cooper left behind. Others were even stranger. Kenneth Christensen, a quiet flight attendant for Northwest Orient, had military parachuting experience, lived modestly, and yet left behind a suspiciously large sum of money after his death. A friend claimed his confession was hiding in plain sight. But again, the evidence was circumstantial. The list grew. Barbara Dayton, a transgender woman who claimed she had staged the hijacking in disguise as a man. Robert Rackstraw, a Vietnam veteran with explosives training and a murky criminal record. Lynn Doyle Cooper, named by a niece who swore he returned from a hunting trip the day after the hijacking, bruised and bloodied. Each suspect seemed to fit, until the details unraveled. The FBI checked fingerprints, DNA, alibis. None connected cleanly. Each man or woman left investigators with the same emptiness Cooper had left on that rainy night. No body, no proof, only questions. Over time, the FBI's official stance hardened. They leaned toward the theory that Cooper had not survived, that his jump into the storm was a fatal gamble, and that the mystery endured only because the wilderness had hidden his remains. But even inside the Bureau, not everyone agreed. Some agents swore Cooper was alive, that he had slipped through their fingers and lived quietly, watching his own legend grow. And that was the most unsettling possibility of all: that somewhere in America, an aging man once known as Dan Cooper might still have been smiling at the headlines, knowing the truth belonged to him alone. By the late 1970s, D.B. Cooper was no longer just a name in FBI reports. He had become a figure larger than the case itself, an outlaw folk hero whose mystery captured the American imagination. It began with the media. The very night of the hijacking, a local reporter misheard the suspect's alias, Dan Cooper, and published it as D.B. Cooper. The mistake stuck. From then on, the name carried a sharper edge, almost cinematic, the kind of name that could live forever in rumor. As the years passed with no answers, the myth grew. Bars in the Pacific Northwest sold D.B. Cooper cocktails. Bands wrote songs about him. Writers turned him into a character who lived 100 different lives after the jump, escaping to South America, hiding in the forests, or blending into small-town America as someone's quiet neighbor. What made Cooper so enduring was not violence. He never harmed a passenger, never fired a weapon, never even raised his voice. He was polite, calm, even courteous, tipping a flight attendant and offering cigarettes during the tense hours in the sky. In a decade filled with turbulence, Vietnam, political scandal, rising distrust of institutions, Cooper became the outlaw who broke the rules without cruelty, a mystery that seemed almost stylish in its execution. Copycats emerged, trying to recreate his crime. None succeeded. Some were caught, others died attempting the jump. But each failure only added to Cooper's legend, proof that what he had done was nearly impossible, and yet somehow he had vanished without a trace. Even the FBI could not stop the myth. Their files grew thicker, their suspects more numerous, but each dead end seemed only to feed the story. People debated whether he had drowned in the Columbia River or was sipping whiskey in Mexico under a new name. Some swore he was a former paratrooper. Others believed he was an ordinary man who had pulled off the extraordinary. The truth was irrelevant. By the 1980s, D.B. Cooper was no longer just a hijacker. He was legend. And yet, beneath the jokes, the films, and the songs, the silence of the case still lingered. A man had walked onto a plane, asked for money, and stepped into history. No body, no trace, only endless theories. By the mid-1990s, the story of D.B. Cooper had hardened into legend. His name wasn't just a police file anymore. It was a cultural phenomenon, etched into documentaries, news specials, and late-night talk shows. He had become a symbol of rebellion, a man who seemed to outwit not just law enforcement, but the very laws of possibility. And yet, beneath the myth, one unshakable question remained. What actually happened that night in 1971? The parachute jump itself was perilous, almost suicidal. Cooper leapt into a stormy night, with freezing rain, gusting winds, and rough terrain below. Skydiving experts have argued for decades that the conditions were nearly impossible for survival, especially for someone in loafers and a business suit, carrying a bag of money. The fact that no body or even a shred of his clothing was ever found seemed to suggest something extraordinary. Did he perish in the wilderness, swallowed by rivers and forests? Or was the lack of evidence proof that he succeeded, vanishing cleanly into the darkness with $200,000 and a new life? Theories ran wild. Some believed Cooper died on impact, his parachute caught in trees, his body rotting unnoticed in the Pacific Northwest wilderness. Others claimed he carefully planned the jump, had accomplices waiting, and disappeared into society under a new identity. Every time someone disappeared without a trace in America, whispers of maybe it was D.B. Cooper floated back into the conversation. The FBI, despite its resources, never cracked the case. Agents admitted frustration. Every lead seemed to dissolve into thin air. Every theory raised more questions than answers. Cooper had left nothing behind but a name that wasn't his, a few cigarette butts, and a story that refused to die. And perhaps that's why the mystery endures. Because the truth is still airborne. Somewhere between the storm clouds he jumped through and the quiet ground that never revealed him. Cooper remains the man who walked into history, looked the system in the eye, and vanished before it could catch him. But legends are tricky things. The moment they feel settled, another clue or rumor emerges, pulling the story back into motion. And just when it seemed the trail had gone completely cold, the earth itself offered up something strange. The years rolled on, and the case of D.B. Cooper transformed into something larger than the crime itself. It became folklore, an American legend etched into the collective memory. Songs were written, documentaries produced, books filled with speculation. Yet the truth remained elusive. The FBI, after decades of frustration, finally closed its official investigation in 2016, declaring that it had expended countless hours and resources with nothing to show for it. The Bureau admitted that while it could not prove who Cooper was, the mystery was unlikely to ever be solved. For the first time, the name D.B. Cooper officially passed into history rather than law enforcement pursuit. But for the public, closing the file didn't end the fascination. It only deepened it. If Cooper died in the jump, why was no body ever found? If he lived, how could a man vanish so completely in the modern world, leaving no financial trails, no slips of identity, no whispers from accomplices? Today, half a century later, the case remains a riddle wrapped in shadows. The man who stepped onto Flight 305 has become a symbol of rebellion, ingenuity, and the allure of the unknown. Some see him as a criminal, others as a folk hero. What lingers, however, is not the $200,000, nor the hijacking itself, but the haunting silence he left behind. He became a ghost the moment his parachute disappeared into the storm, and to this day, we are still chasing the echo of that night. Because in the end, the truth about D.B. Cooper may not lie in FBI files or scattered bills along riverbanks, but in the very idea that he accomplished the impossible. He walked onto a plane a stranger and vanished into legend. And so, the night of November 24th, 1971, drifts further into history, yet it refuses to fade. Every gust of wind over the Pacific Northwest, every shadow cast on the pines, feels as if it could still be hiding him. D.B. Cooper is no longer just a man. He has become a question that swallows time, that outlived the investigation, the suspects, and even the men who chased him. The ransom money may have disappeared, but the mystery has grown richer with every passing decade. Perhaps he died in the cold embrace of the storm. Perhaps he walked away under another name, watching the world chase a ghost he created. We may never know, but that's the nature of true mysteries. Sometimes it's not the answer we seek that endures, but the silence that follows. A silence that whispers in every unsolved corner of history the same unshakable thought. Some truths are not lost. They are hidden, waiting. Stay curious, for the shadows still have stories to tell. Stay with Nexora.